Hey everyone, we still have some spots left on our trip to Chile and Argentina. We are going from February 27th until March 5th, 2025, and we are nearing the deadline to sign up. We'll be going on cable cars in Santiago, wine tasting, we'll visit the historic city of Valparaiso, and then we're going to cross the Andes to be in Mendoza in time for the annual Grape Harvest Festival. Additionally, Josh, Elaney, and I are going to host breakout groups on how to get started on podcasting, as well as some discussion of true crime topics. It's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and in my family, we tend to focus on experiences over things when we're giving gifts. So we're much more likely to get the kids a pool pass for the summer, or concert tickets, or even elements of a trip for the holidays. And this philosophy isn't just for kids. This trip is my Christmas gift to myself, and I will be thanking myself for it for years to come. The company we're using offers payment plans, and the link is in the show notes that'll get you to the pricing, what's included, how to sign up, how to apply for financing if needed, and all of the information that you could ever need or want. But if you have more questions, feel free to just email me. So again, check the show notes for that link. When teenagers do something very bad, it's normal to look for where the blame should be placed. Was it the parents, or the bullies at school, or bad influences? In one case out of Ohio, the blame was placed on a violent influence that came from video games. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This case that I'm covering today, the coverage of it was inspired by a case I did for my Patreon show, Beyond the Files. That case was from the early 1990s, and of course, it had to have a passing mention of satanic cultists. It wasn't a big part of the case, but it did make me think about if we've ever had anything else quite like satanic panic, this idea that people were rallying around a cause of violence like that. The only other thing that I really thought about was violent media, specifically video games, so I decided it was worth exploring a case where this did come up. Let's go ahead and get started with the Petric family. Susan Petric was born in September of 1964 in Maryland, and when she was in her early 20s, she married Mark Petric. The two would go on to have 3 children together, 2 girls and a boy. Mark was a minister, so the family moved around a little bit between the Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio areas, as Mark worked as a pastor in the Assemblies of God Church. Along with working as an associate pastor and a youth pastor, Mark and Sue also worked as house parents at a residential home for troubled teen boys. In 2003, the family moved to Wellington, Ohio, which is less than an hour outside of Cleveland. Mark was the minister at the New Life Assembly of God Church, while Sue worked as a bookkeeper at an assisted living facility. A few years after they moved out to the area, they bought a 3-bedroom house on a 7-acre lot just outside of Wellington. It was a very nice property if you like a bit of country living. At this point, only 2 of the kids were still at home. Mark and Sue's oldest daughter, Heidi, was 21, and she was married. Holly was 17, and Danny was 16, and they were a senior and a junior at the local high school. The family was a pretty typical minister's family. Mark was the pastor, and Sue was the loving, easygoing pastor's wife. She would help church members out, and she would fill in for absent Sunday school teachers while also being very quick with a joke. One time she brought a whoopee cushion to a church meeting just to get a laugh. As for the kids, their oldest daughter Heidi married a young man named Andy, and they were youth ministers at the church. Danny, their only son, was on the Bible quiz team where they would go up against other church youth groups in a quiz bowl style competition. Danny knew the Bible very well, not just the stories, but he could also quote a lot of scripture. The family spent a lot of time together, with Heidi and Andy being regulars at the Petric family home, even though they were living out on their own. And Heidi and Andy had plans to hang out with the family on October 20th, 2007. Their plan was to watch baseball. That year, the Cleveland Indians were playing in the American League Championship Series against the Red Sox. Saturday, October 20th was the 6th game, and it looked possible Cleveland would win the series because they had already won 3 of the games. For my international and or non-baseball following audience, whichever team wins 4 of the 7 games wins the whole series. And then that's the team that goes on to play in the World Series, which is the final postseason game. It's a pretty big deal if your team makes it that far, so Heidi and Andy decided to go over to the family home so they could all cheer on the home team together. The game started around 8:30 at night, and Heidi and Andy weren't planning to be there until around 9. But their plans changed, and they decided to head over a bit early, actually more than a bit early. They got to the house a little before 7, which was 2 hours early. When they got there, they went up on the porch, but 16-year-old Danny came to the door and sort of intercepted them. Danny told them they couldn't come in because, quote, Mom and Dad were fighting. That was a strange thing for him to say, and he was also blocking their way into the house, so they were a bit unsure what was going on. But then they heard a groan from inside. Heidi and Andy ended up pushing their way past Danny, and they saw why he was stopping them from coming in. In the living room, on separate couches, were Sue and Mark Petric, and they were both bleeding from the head. Andy and Heidi checked on Sue first, and it was obvious she was already dead. But Mark was the source of the groaning sounds. He was still alive, though severely injured. So Andy applied pressure to the wound while Heidi called 911. That call came in at 6:58 p.m. Heidi was understandably frantic. She told the dispatcher that she and her husband came over to find both of her parents shot, and her brother, who was not shot, was the only other person home. Mark and Sue's 17-year-old daughter was at her fast food job that evening. The dispatcher asked Heidi if she thought her brother had shot their parents, and she said she didn't know. By the time the first responders got to the scene, Danny was gone. Heidi and Andy said that when they got inside and saw Mark and Sue injured, at first, Danny picked up a gun that was in the living room. The family did have guns, but this handgun was normally kept in a lockbox, not just out in the open. Andy was quick thinking, and he managed to take the gun off of Danny, though it doesn't sound like Danny put up much of a fight. But while Andy and Heidi were administering first aid, Danny made a phone call, and then he left the house in the family's Ford Windstar. The person Danny called was actually Andy's younger brother, who he was friends with. With this area not being very big, and there not being a lot of roads between point A and point B, a patrol car was very quickly able to find Danny driving the minivan on his way to Andy's brother's house. And when I say they found him quickly, I mean they pulled him over and took him into custody 10 minutes after the 911 call. Meanwhile, back at the house, 43-year-old Susan Petric was declared dead. She had been shot 3 times, with 2 of the shots going into her arms as she tried to shield herself. The 3rd shot, the fatal one, was to her head. 45-year-old Mark Petric was rushed to the hospital in critical condition as his jaw had been broken in multiple places due to the gunshot to the side of his head. He was in and out of consciousness and tried to talk, but due to the extensive damage to his jaw, he was nearly impossible to understand. The one thing they could understand was Mark identifying the shooter. It was Danny. Danny was taken to the police station and he was asked what happened. He said he was in his room while his parents were arguing in the living room. His father was screaming at his mother and then suddenly went into the bedroom, was in there for a short time before coming back out and heading to the living room. Shortly after this, Danny heard shots fired. He ran into the living room to see what was going on, and he saw his mother on the love seat, shot in the head, and Mark was holding the gun. Mark first pointed the gun at Danny, but then said, "I'm sorry," and turned the gun on himself. Danny cried as he told this story, or at least he appeared to be crying on the video recording. He was at least making crying noises, and his voice was strained, but the investigator later said there were no tears. The boo-hooing, as he called it, didn't seem sincere. The investigators told Danny they didn't believe him and that his father had survived the shooting. He could tell them who shot him and who shot Sue, which was true. They weren't lying to Danny, even though we know the police could have done so. So it only took a little bit more pressure before Danny finally admitted that his father didn't do it. He did. And to understand what happened, we have to back up because there is some context we need. Over a year before this, Danny had been snowboarding when he got hurt. The injury ended up leading to a severe staph infection that affected his spine, which is a somewhat rare condition, but it can be very serious. Even with immediate treatment, it can take 1 to 6 months to recover. And if you don't recover well, it can damage your vertebrae, which would then lead to lifelong disabling consequences. And it sounded like Danny's situation may have been resistant to treatment because he was told he couldn't really do much physically for upwards of a year. Danny had been an active kid prior to this, and while he wasn't bedbound, he still couldn't run around or play soccer or football, and he very quickly got bored. To keep Danny occupied, his parents agreed to let him play more video games than usual, and it really is what he chose to do to pass the time. And he loved it. He got really into these video games, whether he was playing at his own home or over at a friend's house. His friend's house was key to this because Mark and Sue were a bit on the strict side when it came to these video games. They did not allow violent or sexual content at all. Danny mostly played sports-based video games at that point, but at his friend Jonathan's house, he had access to other games, and he was introduced to the Halo series, though in 2007, it admittedly wasn't much of a series yet. There were only 2 games out so far, and Danny played both of them when he was at Jonathan's. And as any fan of the game would, Danny looked forward to the September 2007 release of Halo 3. Everything I know about Halo, I learned against my will. I have many sons, 3 of whom are in their 20s now, and they are and were into video gaming. I remember when one of my boys wanted one of these first-person shooter-type games when he was 13 or 14, and I stood in the Target Electronics section asking some poor 17-year-old employee who couldn't have cared less in-depth questions about the gore and the violence in the game. All you really need to know about Halo is that, like I said, it's a first-person shooter game, and you are shooting aliens. According to Common Sense Media, Halo games tend to be about 16 years old and up in their recommendation, but knowing families who are more conservative about violent media, particularly when it comes to first-person shooter games, it does not surprise me that Mark and Sue did not approve of this game, even though Danny was 16. So Danny was not supposed to play the game, but he did so at his friend's house. That's pretty typical for a teenager to enjoy the different rules at different houses, but Danny wanted more access to the game. He didn't want to only be able to play this game at his friend's house. So when Halo 3 was released in late September 2007, Danny snuck out of his bedroom window and went to the store and bought it. But, as happens, it wasn't the sneaking out that was the problem, it was the trying to get back in. His parents caught him, and Mark confiscated the game. He ended up putting it in the lockbox that he kept for his handgun. To get a little bit more exact with the timeline, Halo 3 was released on September 25th, 2007, so it would have been right around that day that the game got taken away. Danny did not take this well at all, and he and Mark argued over it for the next 2 or 3 weeks. In mid-October, after one particularly contentious argument, Mark said if Danny couldn't live without the game, he needed to find somewhere else to live. So that's what Danny did. Telling his friend Jonathan that he had been kicked out, he spent the weekend of October 13th, a week before the shooting, at Jonathan's house. And while there, they played Halo pretty much nonstop. They took breaks to eat and sleep a little, but otherwise, it was a marathon gaming session all weekend long. It only took a few days for things between Danny and Mark to be patched up enough that he could come home. Or at least Sue and Mark thought things were in a good enough place for that. At some point after this, Danny snuck the key to the lockbox and took out both his Halo game and his father's gun. There is debate on when this happened on our timeline. At trial, the state would say it happened about a week in advance, so not long after he came home from staying with Jonathan, but the defense would say it was actually on the day of the shooting, and we'll get into why that matters when we get to the trial. Either way, we know Danny got the key without Mark or Sue realizing it, and he got out his video game, and he took the gun as well. Shortly before his sister and brother-in-law got to the house, Danny walked into the living room and asked his parents to close their eyes. Mark said that Danny said he had a surprise for them. Assuming it was something positive, they closed their eyes, and Mark said he suddenly felt his head get numb. Sue, who would have heard the shot, put up her hands to try to protect herself. But with his father's 9mm gun, Danny shot Sue 3 times. Danny then sat on the couch next to Mark and said, "Here's your gun, take it." Mark wasn't dead, and Danny knew that, but he couldn't shoot him again. His plan was to stage this as a murder-suicide, with Mark appearing to have killed Sue before then turning the gun on himself. And that's the story he initially tried to pass off to the police. If Mark was shot more than once, the plan would have immediately fallen apart. So Danny tried to put the gun in his hand and hoped that he could still pass it off that way. Maybe if Mark laid on the couch long enough, he might have eventually died. Danny was going to then leave the house so that his sister and brother-in-law would walk in and find the bodies in 2 hours when they got to the house. But they showed up early, very early. Danny tried to stop them from coming in, and he gave the first excuse he could think of, the one about Mark and Sue fighting. But Mark heard them at the door, and the groaning they heard were his attempts to call out through his broken jaw. Had they not gotten there so early, and had Andy not administered first aid, it seems likely Mark would have died. You may think there was no way all of this happened over Sue and Mark not letting Danny have a video game at home. But when Danny was pulled over, they found the copy of Halo 3 on the front seat. It was the only thing he grabbed when he fled the house. According to Danny, it was all about that game. When word got out that Danny was arrested for his mother's murder and the attempted murder of his father, people were shocked. They had not seen any warning signs. After homeschooling for a while, Danny started high school in his sophomore year, which is the second year of high school. He was considered intelligent, particularly as he could memorize all of those Bible scriptures and trivia. But when it came to secular subjects, he was a middle-of-the-road student. His grade point average was a 2.7, and the average GPA of a high school graduate in the United States is 3.0, so he wasn't that far below average. And as someone who homeschooled my kids and then put them in the school system, I had 2 kids who did just fine immediately, and 2 who needed some time to adjust to the formal schooling model. Their grades initially were not really a reflection of their intelligence or their potential. Both of them ended up graduating high school in the top 10% of their classes, so it's possible Danny, who had only been in public school for a year at that point, would have pulled his GPA up once he either caught up academically or adjusted to the demands of formal schooling. Overall, he was a good student, he was a nice and polite kid, and he had a little bit of a class clown sense of humor at times, which it sounds like he got from his mom. If he got mad or frustrated, he would usually get quiet, but he didn't act out. No one ever saw him lash out in anger, and he was never a bully. And he wasn't the target of bullies either. But Danny confessed, and Mark identified him as the shooter. There was no question he did this. So he remained locked up on pretrial detention, even though his grandfather had volunteered to supervise him at his home if he could make bail. The judge did show Danny one mercy in the pretrial process. Danny wanted to go to his mother's funeral, but the judge said no. Instead, he allowed him, escorted by deputies, to view her body and spend 30 minutes in prayer with her to say goodbye. But Danny was to be alone without family during this time. The state didn't want Danny to be given this time at all, given that Mark, Sue's husband of over 20 years, was in a medically induced coma and wouldn't be at her funeral or even have 5 minutes to say goodbye at church. But the judge felt that a short, private viewing was a fair compromise, taking into account everyone's needs, including Danny's. The day after Danny said goodbye to his mother, 500 people attended Sue's funeral, and they did talk about her being a mother, so by extension, Danny was mentioned. But only vague references to what Danny did came up, like when the minister said that they were not there to answer, quote, unanswerable questions. He said they were there to celebrate Sue's life, and that is definitely where this service put the focus. And like I said, Mark was still in the hospital at this point. It was 2 weeks before he was fully conscious, and they knew he would recover. He said when he first came to and processed what had happened, what he remembered happened, and what he was told happened, he said he hated Danny. If he could get his hands on him, he was pretty sure he would have killed him for killing Sue. But being a deeply religious man, Mark prayed about it. He prayed a lot, and he found it within himself and within the context of his faith to forgive his son. The courts, of course, are not going to be quite so merciful. Danny's attorney wanted to make a plea deal right away. Danny would plead guilty if they let him stay in the juvenile court system, which would mean he would only be incarcerated until he was 21. But that was not going to happen. Ohio state law requires 16 and 17-year-olds charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, or attempted murder to be transferred to the adult system. The debate over why the age for being an adult seems to change in the U.S. depending on the situation. It's 16 if you commit murder, 18 if you want to join the military, but 21 if you want to drink. That conversation has no place in the Ohio courts for 16 and 17-year-olds because the law spells it out. So the case was moved to the adult system, and Danny was moved from juvenile detention to the county jail, which I just don't get. I've seen other cases where the minor defendant is left in juvenile incarceration even though their case is in the adult courts because they're still juveniles. But they went ahead and moved him to county lockup even though they then had to isolate him from the adult inmates. If you're going to isolate him anyway because he's a minor, why not just leave him in juvenile detention where he could hopefully get some type of education while he was waiting on trial? I kind of wonder if this came out of the super predator narrative. This is something else that pops into my head when I think of satanic panic. The super predator was overblown fear-mongering that came from a 1995 study that predicted that we had on our hands a generation of teens who were super predators. And by the year 2000, there would be an additional 30,000 young psychopathic murderers, rapists, and robbers out there. This study was flawed, and the statistics never supported it. In fact, violent crime rates among teens were dropping at the time. But the media picked this up and went absolutely wild with it. And people got scared. And politicians who like to get elected don't like to have scared voters. Well, actually, they do like to have scared voters so that they can promise to be tough on crime to get their vote. So we ended up with a juvenile criminal justice reform that treats kids like adults in large part due to this one overblown study. There is so much more to this, so if you want to look up super predators, I highly recommend it. And I'm only offering it here as a crumb of context, but it is largely a tangent, so we're going to get back on topic. The state would not accept a guilty plea in juvenile court because they didn't want to, and also because it wasn't in line with state law, but they did offer a plea deal in adult court. If Danny pleaded guilty, the judge would give him the minimum sentence, 23 years to life. If he went to trial, he would face life without parole. Danny turned the plea down, so they were headed to trial. In the meantime, Mark was released from the hospital after about a month, and he went to visit Danny in lockup. Danny told Mark he was sorry, and Mark let Danny know that he forgave him. Mark wanted more visits with Danny than the one 30-minute visit per week allowed by the county jail. Obviously, some of that desire was because he was his father and wanted to support his son, but he was also Danny's pastor, and he wanted to counsel him on a spiritual level. So he asked the court to recognize him as Danny's clergy, which would have allowed him to visit virtually whenever he wanted. This was a very unusual request for a victim in the case to also be the clergy for the perpetrator. And it caused an unusual conflict. Normally, whatever Danny would tell his minister would be confidential, but in this case, Mark was going to have to testify as to what happened as the victim and surviving witness. There was concern about how he would and could balance his role as a member of the clergy with his testimony in court. A legal consultant told the Associated Press at the time that significant research would have to be done to find out if there was even precedent for a situation like this in any jurisdiction. This may be the first time it has ever come up. In the end, the judge decided to split the difference. Yes, Mark could have increased visits with Danny as his minister, but unlike in other situations, their communications would not have the same clergy-parishioner privacy. Whatever they spoke about may become part of the legal case. In the end, none of their conversations became part of the trial in a way that hurt Danny. He was not arguing the facts of the case. He didn't contest Mark's testimony that he was the shooter, or his sister and brother-in-law's testimony about his actions that evening. What he would argue was his mental state at the time of the shooting. As such, Danny opted for a bench trial with a judge rather than going in front of a jury. The only thing from the visits between Mark and Danny that came up at trial was something that helped Danny. Mark testified that Danny was truly sorry for what he did, and he didn't fully understand why he did it. Mark also testified that he and Danny had a good relationship until he put his foot down about Halo. And this played into the defense as they were arguing that the removal of the video game was the catalyst to the shooting. Danny had been under incredible stress due to the staph infection, and while stuck doing nothing for a year, he became obsessed with video games, possibly even addicted to them. So when Mark and Sue took away the game he was the most addicted to, he snapped and wasn't in his right mind. The issue here for me was that the game was taken away a month before the shooting. So why did Danny suddenly feel he just had to have the game badly enough to kill for it? Well, his friend Jonathan testified that they would normally play Halo for hours at his house, 7 or 8 hours straight. But the week before the shooting, when Danny stayed there for the weekend, they played a lot more. They were playing 16 to 18 hours each day, barely breaking even to sleep. The defense was approaching this sort of like the behavior of an addict being separated from their drug of choice. They said Danny didn't go get the key and open the lockbox to get the gun. He went in there just to get his game, and then he saw the gun, and that's when he decided to kill his parents. It was a spur of the moment of insanity. But that's not entirely backed up by the psychologist the defense hired to evaluate Danny. He said Danny told him he had been planning the murders for a week. Danny said he wanted to make his own decisions in life and felt that his parents put too many rules on him. The Halo game was definitely one of them, and maybe even the biggest issue, but it wasn't the only issue. Something that surprised me about this trial was the lack of experts outside of the psychologist. I know when it's just a judge and there's no jury, there often won't be as many witnesses and back and forth, but they didn't have any experts to talk about how violent video games desensitize people to violence and the effects of that. They didn't have an expert on addiction, specifically addiction to media, testify to how that impacts young minds. And that surprised me because that's essentially their entire defense, the cumulative effects of these things on a stressed-out 16-year-old who recently had a serious medical issue. You add it up and you get diminished capacity, according to the defense. The trial ended in mid-December 2008, and the judge said he expected to announce his verdict in January of 2009. And we've seen this before with bench trials. While juries deliberate until they get to their verdict, judges tend to take more time with their decisions. On January 11th, 2009, the verdict was in. The judge found Danny Petric guilty of the aggravated murder of his mother and the attempted aggravated murder of his father, as well as tampering with evidence and a number of other charges related to these three main ones. This didn't mean that the judge fully rejected Danny's defense. He did believe that the video game had influenced him. He thought that, at the time, Danny didn't truly understand that dead meant dead forever, because in the game the players regenerated at the end of the level. And this is where I disagree with the judge. I don't mean I agree or disagree about whether Danny thought dead meant dead or not. I don't have nearly enough information to evaluate that, and even if I did have the information, I certainly don't have the education. I'm not capable of making that type of call. What I mean is, I disagree that a 16-year-old can be so delusional as to not know that dead meant dead forever, and could still be considered criminally responsible. I find these two positions to be in direct conflict of each other. In Ohio, not guilty by reason of insanity is if the person proves, quote, that at the time of the commission of the offense, the person did not know as a result of severe mental disease or defect the wrongfulness of the person's acts, end quote. So if you were so far gone that you didn't know that dead meant dead, wouldn't that also lead to not knowing that what you did was wrong if you thought your mom was going to just come back to life? I don't really understand the judge's line of thinking here, except that he said the law required more to prove the insanity claim. So maybe he leaned towards it being a possibility, but didn't feel like it was proven. A big sticking point for the judge seems to be that Danny planned the shooting. Danny's defense was that he didn't plan it. He had snuck the key to the lockbox, got the game, and saw the gun in there. Then he decided to kill his parents. But like I said before, based on something Danny said to the psychologist, it sounded like he had planned it for a week. Planning does undermine the idea of insanity, but I don't think it overrides the judge's assessment that he thought his mother would still be alive after he killed her. But Danny was found guilty, and as you can imagine, the sentencing hearing was beyond emotional. Mark Petric spoke on behalf of the family and as a victim, and asked that Danny be given a second chance. He said Danny has shown remorse regularly for what he did. He could see that Danny's pain ran deep, and if it didn't, he wouldn't have been there speaking on his behalf. Mark agreed Danny should face a harsh consequence for what he did, but he did want him to have a chance of parole. After Mark spoke, Danny stood up to speak on his own behalf, but he was so overcome with emotion that he stood there trying to compose himself for about 10 seconds, and then he shook his head and sat back down. The prosecutor then spoke and expressed sympathy for the family and for the impossible situation they were in. But he disagreed that Danny deserved mercy in sentencing. He said he was not there to discount the love of the family or the mercy of God, but he didn't represent them. He represented the people of the county, and the people would be best served with Danny locked up for as long as possible. One thing the prosecutor pointed out that I thought was persuasive was that Danny said that if not for Mark, he thought his mother would have let him play the game. So to get access to the game, he only needed to kill his father. But to get away with killing his father, he had to stage the scene as a murder-suicide. So he shot and killed Sue as well. So what does that make Sue? Was she just collateral damage? The fact that Danny staged the scene like this, trying to frame his father, who was his victim, for a murder-suicide called for a stiffer sentence, according to the state. The prosecutor also pointed out that Danny would have been eligible for the death penalty in this case if he was 2 years older. So he was essentially already being shown mercy based on his age. The state felt that a life without parole sentence for the murder of Sue Petric was fair, and then add on an additional 21 years for the shooting of Mark Petric. When the judge made his ruling on sentencing, he made a few remarks and said that he felt the violent video game playing did alter Danny's functioning, and that it was hard to say when that type of behavior would extinguish. The judge noted that he didn't see a past of issues like running away, bullying, hurting people or animals, so he didn't think this was part of Danny's fundamental makeup that would never change. It just might take a while. Would he still be wired towards violence in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? It was hard to say. The judge said it was difficult to see Danny's remorse in various actions and statements he made, but he believed that the lack of remorse was because of the obsession and addiction to the game, and not something he didn't feel just because he was a psychopath. The judge then made a comment that seemed a little off topic. He said that he was speaking for the future, not for radio talk shows that have become, quote, little more than an affirmative action program for countless overweight, intellectually challenged white boys, end quote. I would really love to know the context of this comment. I know this case was discussed nationally and also locally, and I'm sure talk radio had plenty to say about it. I'm just not sure which opinionated white man with a radio show he was talking about. Anyway, for the purposes of sentencing, the judge combined the 11 separate charges and combined them with the 3 main ones. So Danny got 20 years to life for the murder of his mother, Sue, 10 years for the attempted murder of his father, and 5 years for tampering with evidence, all of these to run concurrent. There was an additional 3-year sentencing enhancement for the use of a firearm, which meant Danny Petric will be eligible for parole after 23 years. This sentence was the minimum sentence and what the prosecution had essentially offered him during plea negotiations. Danny's first hearing is in September of 2030, which is about 6 years from this recording. After Danny's conviction and sentencing, Mark Petric started speaking more openly about the circumstances that led to the shooting and his views on violent video games. He does believe that violent first-person shooter games teach children that shooting is okay, or at least desensitize them to the fact that it is wrong. And I personally think that Mark's point of view is being too quickly dismissed because the studies don't bear it out. In broader studies of both teen killers and violent video games, there is not a causation between the people who play this type of game and increased violent behavior. There just isn't. But if you've been listening to Crimelines for any length of time, you know that I dismiss a lot of ideas based on research not bearing them out. So my take might be surprising to you, but what I'm saying is that just because something doesn't apply broadly doesn't mean it never applies individually. It's the difference between sociology and psychology. Danny had other risk factors here. He had that injury that led to a serious illness that had potentially life-altering complications hanging over him. So we have recent medical trauma. He had depression. Maybe he was more susceptible to the influences of violent video games. Or maybe he didn't have a full-blown addiction to the video games in the way we usually think of addiction, but he did have an obsession with this particular game. So what I'm left wondering is that if Danny was possibly attracted to this violent media because there was something underlying, an aggression that he had repressed. It's too simplistic, in my opinion, to say the video game addiction or the video game content was at the root of what happened. But it also doesn't mean it didn't contribute at all. I don't think it is helpful to broadly condemn violent video games based on the research we do have. But again, even though it doesn't apply broadly, it might apply individually. So I think it's important to look at individual cases like this one and look at all of the factors that led to the day Danny shot both of his parents. Looking really deep into that, we would get a fuller picture of the warning signs. And that is where we would start getting useful information that would help prevent this from happening in the future. I have covered a couple of cases of teens who killed their parents before. I covered Larry Swartz in September of 2023, and then Gina Grant in November of that same year. In both of those cases, because of the defense that they put up, we have a much deeper insight into what was happening in their lives and in their homes leading up to the murders. We could walk through both cases and see the red flags and warning signs. I don't feel like we have that much information here, which is fine. Because even when someone finds themselves at the center of a case like this, like Mark Petric and his daughters have, they don't owe it to us to put their lives out there to be dissected. It's useful information. It would be helpful information, but they don't owe it to us. I think there is more to the story than simply video games made him do it, and I hope that Danny Petric is spending his time in prison figuring out what that is, so that if or when he gets paroled, he can work towards whatever redemption there is in this world.